Abandoned by her mistress with her babies at the edge of a volcanic crater, a desperate widow finds herself trapped in a missile silo. But instead of danger, the structure proves to be an unexpected refuge, shielding them from the poisonous air. The metallic clang of the gate closing, sealing them in darkness, reverberated through the cavernous space of the silo. Ilara felt the impact in her bones, a sound that should have meant the end, but which, paradoxically, brought a chilling relief. The thin, pungent air that had lashed her lungs outside, at the crater's edge, was absent inside. In its place, a metallic, dusty but breathable smell. She clutched the babies to her chest, feeling their tiny hearts beat in unison with hers. Their crying, which had been a desperate wail, now subsided into sporadic sobs. "We're safe, my loves," she whispered, her voice hoarse more to herself than to them. "For now, we're safe." The darkness was almost absolute, broken only by a faint thread of light that seemed to trickle from some distant crevice at the top of the silo, revealing the imposing silhouette of the metal and concrete walls that rose infinitely above them. The cold was biting, an icy embrace that penetrated her thin clothes and made her shiver uncontrollably. Ilara tried to move, feeling the floor with her foot, sensing the roughness of the concrete and what seemed to be scattered metallic debris. "Where are we, Mama?" The question didn't come from her babies, but echoed in her own mind. She knew where they were, in the particular hell her mistress had chosen for her. An abandoned missile silo, a vertical tomb, but which, by a cruel twist of fate, had become a sanctuary against certain death outside. She knelt carefully, protecting the babies. The floor was cold and hard, but it was solid. The silence that followed the closing of the gate was almost as oppressive as the darkness, broken only by the soft murmur of the babies and the sound of her own ragged breathing. "We need light," she thought, desperate. Her eyes tried to adjust, searching for any shape, any contour. She had a small handheld flashlight, a forgotten gift from her late husband, which she kept in an inner pocket of her worn coat. With trembling hands, she took it out and switched it on. A weak, yellowish beam cut through the darkness, revealing what looked like the bottom of a gigantic well. The walls were of massive concrete, interspersed with rusty metallic structures, platforms, spiral staircases that ascended into nothingness, thick pipes that disappeared into the upper darkness. The air, though breathable, smelled of mold and old metal. The babies, startled by the sudden light, began to whimper again. "Shh, shh," Ilara murmured, rocking them gently. "Mama's here." She swept the flashlight beam across the floor. There was debris, twisted metal pieces, empty boxes, even some torn fabric. Nothing that seemed immediately useful, but she knew she would need everything. The priority now was the cold. Her babies wouldn't survive a night like this. Her eyes landed on a pile of old, dusty tarps in a corner, partially hidden by a piece of equipment that looked like a deactivated engine. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Come on, Ilara," she urged herself, her voice a hoarse whisper that echoed strangely in the space. "You've been through worse." The memory of her mistress, of the cold gaze and the cruel order, ignited a flame of rage in her chest. It wasn't a time for despair, it was a time to fight. For her children. With the babies still nestled in one arm, she crawled towards the tarps. They were heavy and dirty, but they could offer some insulation. That silo, a monument to destruction, was now her only shelter, and she would transform it piece by piece into a home. She had to. With the babies still nestled in one arm, Ilara crawled towards the tarps. They were heavy and dirty, exuding a smell of mold and dust accumulated over decades. Each movement was an effort, her body aching and mind exhausted. But the sight of her children, trembling slightly against her chest, was the driving force that propelled her. She used her foot to pull the first tarp, which scraped with a harsh sound across the concrete. Dust rose in a dense, irritating cloud, making her cough. "Sorry, my loves," she murmured, trying to shield their little faces. The tarps were large, larger than she expected. With difficulty, she managed to unfold one of them, revealing a thick, resistant fabric, though frayed at some edges. It wasn't a soft blanket, but it was a barrier against the relentless cold rising from the floor. She spread the first tarp on the ground, creating a base. Then, with the flashlight held between her teeth to free her hands, she pulled the others. There were 3 in all. The second tarp was used to create a kind of makeshift tent. She propped it against the deactivated equipment, which turned out to be a solid block of rusty metal, and tried to secure the edges with pieces of debris she found nearby, a broken pipe, a metal sheet. It wasn't perfect, but it formed a small, enclosed space, a cocoon against the vast, icy emptiness of the silo. The third tarp, the cleanest she could find, she folded and placed inside the shelter, creating a slightly softer surface for the babies. Finally, with a sigh of relief, Ilara nestled inside the small refuge, pulling the babies close and covering them with what remained of the tarps. The warmth of their bodies, combined with the precarious insulation, began to make a difference. The babies' crying ceased completely, replaced by a soft murmur and the sound of their regular breaths. Ilara felt a pang of exhaustion, but also a deep satisfaction. They were warm, for now. "We're safe, my angels," she whispered, kissing the forehead of one, then the other. The smell of old metal and mold was still present, but now it was the smell of their refuge. With the babies asleep, Ilara picked up the flashlight again, sweeping the beam across the floor around her small camp. The bottom of the silo was a chaos of industrial debris. There were empty metal boxes, thick-cut cables, pieces of concrete that had broken off the walls. Nothing that looked like food or water. The reality of her situation descended upon her with renewed force. The warmth was a victory, but hunger and thirst would be the next enemies. She raised the flashlight, and the beam was lost in the infinite darkness above. The concrete walls rose, imposing and cold, dotted with metallic platforms that spiraled upwards, like a staircase to heaven or to nothingness. Thick pipes, some ruptured and hanging like exposed viscera, ascended and disappeared into the darkness. The silence was almost total, a heavy and oppressive silence, broken only by the distant echo of her own breathing. It was a place of giants, built for a terrible purpose, now a tomb for her and her children. How will we get out of here? The question echoed in her mind, unanswered. The metallic gate up above, which had sealed their fate, seemed unreachable. But despair could not set in. Not now. The image of her mistress's cold face, the indifference in her eyes as she threw them there, ignited a silent fury in Ilara. She would not allow her children to die in that hole. She would not give that woman the satisfaction. Her eyes swept the floor again, searching for anything, any clue. There was a small crack of light, a silver thread that trickled from very, very high up, almost invisible in the immensity. It was the only connection to the outside world, a reminder that despite everything, the sun still existed. "We need water," she thought, her throat dry. And food. The priority was to survive the night. Afterward, she would have to explore. She would have to climb, crawl, search. The silo was a vertical labyrinth, a deadly puzzle. But Ilara was not a woman to give up. She had her children, and for them she would move mountains or transform a missile silo into a home. The fight had just begun. The night's silence in the silo was unlike any other silence Ilara had ever experienced. It wasn't the stillness of nature, nor the emptiness of solitude. It was an industrial silence, heavy, laden with the echo of decades of abandonment, a mute testament to a forgotten purpose. With the babies finally asleep in her arms, under the precarious protection of the tarps, Ilara allowed herself a moment to feel the weight of the situation. The flashlight, now dim, cast dancing shadows on the concrete walls, transforming the metallic structures into sleeping monsters. Exhaustion was a heavy veil over her eyes, but fear and necessity kept her mind sharp. Water, she thought, the word a dry whisper in her throat. The last drop of water she had drunk was hours ago, before being thrown into that abyss. Her babies, still breastfeeding, depended on her, and her body was already beginning to feel the first signs of dehydration and food. Hunger, for now, was a dull ache, but she knew it would soon become a torment. She raised the flashlight again, sweeping the beam across the floor around her small camp. The bottom of the silo was a graveyard of industrial debris. Empty metal boxes, thick cut cables, pieces of concrete that had broken off the walls, forming small piles of rubble. Nothing that looked remotely edible or potable. Her eyes fixed on the walls, rising and following the metallic platforms that spiraled upwards. Where do they lead? She wondered. The faint thread of light trickling from above was an invitation, a distant promise of an outside she could barely imagine. But how to reach it? The stairs looked rusty, perhaps unstable, and even if she managed to climb, what would she find up there? The sealed gate, the poisonous air. A soft whimper from one of the babies brought her back to immediate reality. She nestled him closer, kissing his soft head. "Don't worry, my love. Mama will find a way." Her voice was a thread of hope in the darkness. With the flashlight in one hand, she began to examine the nearest debris. Each object was a possibility, a potential resource. She found a piece of metal pipe, hollow and heavy, that could serve as a tool. Further on, a rusty toolbox, empty, but which could be used to store things. And then, something that made her heart race. Hidden under a twisted metal sheet, there was a small plastic container, the kind used to store liquids. It was dirty, dusty, but seemed intact. With trembling hands, Ilara picked it up. It was empty, but the discovery lit a small flame of hope. If there was a container, perhaps there was something to put in it. She swept the flashlight across the walls again, this time with a more attentive gaze. The thick pipes, some ruptured and hanging like exposed viscera, ascended and disappeared into the darkness. At one point, about 3 meters above the floor, one of the pipes seemed to have a small crack. It wasn't a spring, but there was a dark, damp stain around it. Condensation, or perhaps a leak. "It could be," she whispered, her voice filled with new determination. It was a possibility, however small. But how to reach it? The walls were smooth, and there was nothing to climb nearby. Frustration threatened to overwhelm her, but the image of her mistress, of the cold gaze and cruel satisfaction at seeing her fall into the abyss, propelled her. She would not die there. She would not give her that victory. Ilara laid the empty container beside the babies like a silent promise. The night would be long, and the cold was still biting, but she had a plan. In the morning, when there was a little more light, she would begin to explore the platforms, to look for something that would help her reach that damp stain. She needed water. Above all, she needed water. With the babies nestled against her, Ilara closed her eyes, but sleep did not come easily. Her mind was already charting routes, assessing risks, transforming the vertical labyrinth into a map of possibilities. The silo was a deadly puzzle, yes, but Ilara was a woman with a purpose. And for her children, she would unravel every secret of that place, transforming it piece by piece into her home. The fight had just begun, and she was ready. Dawn in the silo was a veil of almost impenetrable darkness, yielding only slightly as the silver thread of light high above gained a lighter hue, a pale grey that barely dispelled the deepest shadows. Ilara hadn't truly slept. Her body was exhausted, but her mind, a whirlwind of fears and plans, refused to shut down. The babies, however, slept deeply, their small, warm bodies nestled against hers, the soft sound of their breaths, a melody of life in the sepulchral silence. At the first sign of more defined light, Ilara moved cautiously, disentangling herself from the sleeping babies. The morning cold was biting, and she shivered, pulling the tarps further up to ensure they remained warm. The flashlight, now almost dead, emitted a weak, intermittent glow, barely enough to illuminate her steps. She switched it off, saving what remained of its precious battery. The little light filtering from above would have to suffice for now. "Water first," she murmured to herself, her throat raw. The empty plastic container found the night before was her only hope. She picked it up, feeling its light weight and the promise it represented. Her eyes rose to the damp stain on the pipe, about 3 meters above the floor. It seemed so close, yet at the same time unreachable. She began to scour the debris around her small camp with a renewed gaze, not just looking for something, but for anything that could serve as a tool. The piece of metal pipe she had found earlier seemed promising. It was heavy and hollow, about 1 meter long. She picked it up, testing its weight and balance. It could be used to extend her reach, perhaps to hit something, or even as a lever. Further on, under a pile of twisted metal sheets, she discovered a small wooden box, rotten and almost disintegrated, but which contained some rusty screws and, to her surprise, a piece of thick, dirty rope. It wasn't very long, perhaps 2 meters, but it was rope. Ilara's heart leaped. Rope was an invaluable resource. With the pipe and rope in hand, Ilara approached the wall where the cracked pipe displayed the damp stain. She examined the smooth concrete wall, searching for any protrusion, any support. Nothing. It was an unforgiving surface. "How will I climb?" she thought, frustration beginning to seep in. She tried to jump, extending the pipe, but the stain was too high. She couldn't even touch the pipe. Her eyes swept the floor again, desperate. There were piles of rubble, but nothing that could be safely stacked to form a platform. The silo was a labyrinth of metal and concrete, but it seemed to have been designed to prevent any kind of climbing. The image of the sleeping babies, so vulnerable, ignited a new wave of determination. She couldn't give up. She had to find a way. Ilara looked at the rope. It was short, but perhaps it could be used somehow. She tied one end firmly to the metal pipe, creating a kind of makeshift hook. With the empty plastic container in her other hand, she tried to throw the pipe upwards, hoping it would catch on one of the pipe structures. The first attempt failed miserably, the pipe hitting the wall and falling with a dull thud. The second, the third. With each failure, a piece of her hope diminished. Her arms began to ache, and the rising dust made her cough. "Come on, Ilara," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Think, think." She stepped back a little, observing the piping. There was a junction, slightly above the damp stain, where the pipe connected to a larger structure. If she could throw the pipe and it caught there. With a deep breath, Ilara threw the pipe again, this time with more force and precision. The pipe spun in the air and with a metallic sound caught. Not perfectly, but the rope was taut and the pipe was secured at the junction. A wave of euphoria mixed with relief swept through Ilara. It was precarious, but it was something. Carefully she pulled the rope, testing the pipe's firmness. It held. Now, the challenge was to reach the damp stain with the container. The rope wasn't long enough for her to climb, and the pipe was horizontally secured. Ilara looked at the container. It was small. She had an idea. With trembling hands, she tied the handle of the plastic container to the other end of the rope, just below the pipe. With the pipe firmly secured, she could use the rope to swing the container, trying to reach the damp stain. It was a delicate maneuver. She pulled the rope, swinging the container like a pendulum. The container hit the wall, but couldn't get close enough to the stain. With each attempt, frustration grew. "Almost there," she murmured, sweat trickling down her forehead. "Just a little more." Finally, with a stronger swing and a precise flick of her wrist, the container brushed against the damp stain. Ilara held her breath, keeping it there for a few seconds, feeling the moisture against the plastic. When she pulled the container back, there were a few drops of dark, viscous liquid at the bottom. It wasn't pure, crystal-clear water, but it was moisture. It was a start. Exhaustion hit her hard, but the small victory propelled her. She repeated the process once, twice, 3 times, until the bottom of the container held a small puddle of liquid. It was dirty, mixed with dust and perhaps rust from the pipe, but it was liquid. It was the first drop of real hope. With the container precariously full, Ilara untied the rope from the pipe, which fell with a thud. She knelt beside the babies, who were beginning to stir, waking up. "Look, my loves," she whispered, showing them the container. "Mama got some water." It wasn't enough for them to drink directly, not without purification, but it was a sign, proof that even in that hell of metal and concrete, life could find a way. The fight had just begun, but Ilara had made her first conquest. The silo was still a monster, but she had found one of its veins, and she wouldn't stop until she found its heart. The babies were now fully awake, their thin, hungry cries echoing in the vast, cold space of the silo. Ilara felt a tightening in her chest. The small puddle of dark liquid in the plastic container seemed like a cruel joke in the face of their urgent needs. She held it up, examining it under the pale light that barely reached the bottom of the abyss. It was viscous, with particles of rust and dust floating in it. It was definitely not something she could give her children. "Don't worry, my loves," she murmured, her voice hoarse with fatigue and anxiety. "Mama will find a way." She sat down, nestling one of the louder crying babies, while the other stirred restlessly. The need for water was immediate, but the need for purification was equally pressing. How? She swept her gaze around, seeking inspiration from the debris. The tarps covering them were old and dirty, but perhaps they could serve as a rudimentary filter. She took a piece of the cleanest tarp she could find, tearing a strip with difficulty. The fabric was thick and rough. Carefully, she folded the strip several times, creating a thicker layer. Positioning the empty plastic container on the floor, she held the folded tarp over the opening and, with trembling hands, began to pour the dirty liquid from the first container over the improvised filter. The first drops that dripped into the bottom container were still dark, but as more liquid passed through, the color seemed to lighten a little. It was a slow and painful process, each drop an eternity. When all the liquid had passed through, what remained in the container was a small amount of murky water, still brownish in tint, but without the visible particles from before. It wasn't crystal clear, far from it, but it was an improvement. Ilara dipped her fingertip into the filtered water and brought it to her lips. It had a metallic, earthy taste, but it wasn't undrinkable. It was water. Water that perhaps could be boiled to become safe. But how to boil it? There was no fire, nor any way to make one. The babies' crying intensified. They couldn't wait for a fire that might never come. That little bit of water would barely moisten their lips. "It's the best I can do for now," she whispered, her voice choked. She moistened a corner of the filtered tarp in the murky water and carefully touched the parched lips of one of the babies. He made a small, sucking sound, but soon turned his head away, unsatisfied. Frustration and despair threatened to crush her. She had fought so hard to get that, and yet it was so little, so inadequate. The image of her mistress, of her sadistic smile, returned to haunt her. Ilara clenched her fists. No, she would not allow that woman the victory. She needed more water, and a way to truly purify it. That silo was a labyrinth, but also a repository of secrets. If there were pipes and complex structures, perhaps there was something more. Her eyes rose to the metallic platforms that extended in levels above her, disappearing into the gloom. They were like giant steps of a staircase to the unknown. She had focused on the floor and the lower walls, but the silo was vertical. The heart she sought, the source of pure water, could be anywhere, but her intuition told her it would be deeper, or perhaps on a more protected level. "We need to go higher," she decided, her voice firm, though fear still gnawed at her from within. "Or deeper." The metal pipe and the rope were still there, her only allies. She needed a plan to reach the upper platforms. The day was just beginning, and the light, though faint, was an invitation to explore. With the babies nestled again and the murky water container put away, Ilara began to mentally chart a path. The nearest platform was about 3 meters above her, quite a challenge. She picked up the metal pipe and the rope. The idea of throwing the pipe and trying to secure it again seemed the most viable. She tied the rope firmly to the pipe, this time with a more elaborate knot she had learned on the farm for tying bales. With the babies watching her from the floor, Ilara positioned herself. She aimed for one of the platform's support beams, which seemed more robust. The first attempt failed, the pipe hitting the beam and falling back with a thud. The babies startled, and one of them let out a louder cry. "Sorry, my loves," Ilara whispered, picking up the pipe again. The second attempt was more precise, but the pipe merely slid off the beam. Frustration was a weight in her chest. Her arms were already aching from the previous attempt to collect water. "Think, Ilara, think!" she scolded herself. "There has to be a way." She looked at the pipe. It was heavy, but not enough to secure itself by gravity. She needed something that could create friction. Her eyes swept the floor again. There were pieces of dried rubber, bare electrical wires, and more twisted metal sheets. Nothing that could be easily adapted. Then she saw it. A piece of thick fabric, which seemed to be part of an old conveyor belt, was caught under a pile of rubble. It was wide and sturdy. With effort, she managed to pull it out. The fabric was rough and had a rubbery texture. An idea sparked. She tore a strip from the belt and wrapped it firmly around one end of the pipe, securing it with the rope. This would create a rougher surface with more friction. "Let's see now," she murmured with a new wave of hope. With a deep breath, Ilara threw the pipe again, aiming for the same beam. This time, the pipe spun and, with a muffled sound, caught. The rubber strip created the necessary friction, and the pipe rested firmly on the beam, the rope stretched downwards. A wave of relief and exhaustion washed over her. It was precarious, but it was a foothold. She pulled the rope, testing its firmness. The pipe held. Now the challenge was to climb. The rope was not a ladder, and the pipe was too high for her to push herself up with her feet. Ilara looked at the babies, who watched her with curious eyes. She couldn't take them with her on the first climb. She needed to first ensure the platform's safety. "Mama will be right back," she promised, kissing one of their foreheads. With trembling hands, she began to climb the rope, using her feet to push herself off the smooth wall as much as she could. It was a brutal effort. Her muscles screamed, and the dust dislodged from the wall made her cough. Every inch was a battle. When she finally reached the pipe, she clung to it, gasping, feeling the pain in every fiber of her body. With a final effort, she pushed herself up, managing to grasp the edge of the platform. Her fingers scraped against the cold, rusty metal. She pulled herself up, her body trembling, until she managed to roll onto the platform. She was there, on the first level. The view from above was different, darker, with more metallic structures and pipes that disappeared into the darkness above. The air seemed a little denser, but no less cold. Ilara crawled to the edge, looking down at her babies below. They looked so small, so vulnerable. "I made it, my loves," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion and effort. The platform was filled with more debris, empty metal boxes, tangled wires, and what looked like remnants of electronic equipment. There were no signs of pure water there, but the exploration had just begun. She needed to find a way to bring the babies up or descend with something that could help them. The silo wasn't just a prison, it was a challenge, and she would meet it. Ilara crawled onto the platform, her body protesting with every movement. The thin, cold air seemed to cut her lungs, and the taste of rust and dust filled her mouth. She was exhausted, but adrenaline still coursed through her veins, driven by the image of her babies below. They were tiny, vulnerable specks in the dark vastness of the silo, and the distance between them now seemed even greater, an abyss separating her from her heart. "I made it, my loves," she repeated, her voice hoarse, more to herself than to them. The sound echoed, faint and solitary. She crawled to the edge, looking down. The babies were still there, one stirring restlessly, the other with a muffled cry. Guilt hit her like a punch. She had left them alone, even if only for a short time. The platform was a tangle of twisted metal, empty boxes and bare wires, exactly as she had imagined. The pale light from the top of the silo barely reached that level, casting dancing shadows that transformed each object into a menacing shape. Ilara forced herself to stand, her muscles trembling. She needed to act. There was no time for fear or exhaustion. Her eyes swept the surroundings. There were no signs of water, nor anything that could be used to purify it. But there was something more important now, a safe place for her children. She began to explore, moving cautiously among the debris. In a corner, partially hidden by a pile of metal sheets, she found a small recess in the silo wall, a kind of niche that seemed to have been part of a control panel or a maintenance locker. It was narrow, but deep enough to shelter one of the babies, perhaps even both, if they huddled close. The floor of the niche was metal, but it seemed cleaner than the rest of the platform. "This will do," she murmured, a spark of hope igniting. It was a temporary shelter, a starting point. But how to bring them up? The rope and pipe weren't safe for a baby. She needed something more. As she examined the niche, her eyes fell upon a semi-hidden object. It was a kind of old toolbox, rusty and dented, but still closed. With considerable effort, Ilara managed to open it. Inside, there were some screwdrivers, pliers, and, to her surprise, a roll of thin but sturdy steel cable and a small carabiner. The steel cable! It was stronger and thinner than the rope, and the carabiner could be used to secure something safely. It wasn't a ladder, but it was a tool. She could use it to create a safer hoisting system. She pulled the cable, testing its strength. It seemed good, but there was still the container problem. She couldn't simply tie the babies. She needed something that could hold them. Her eyes returned to the empty metal boxes scattered across the platform. Most were large and heavy, but one, which seemed to have contained smaller parts, was the right size. It was metal, with rounded edges and a lid that, though rusty, still fit. Perfect, she thought, a new wave of determination propelling her. The box was heavy, but not impossible to move. She dragged it to the edge of the platform, near where the pipe was secured. The idea was simple, but risky. Tie the steel cable to the box, lower the box to the babies, place them inside, and then hoist them up one by one. The fear of failure was paralyzing, but the image of her children's hungry, frightened faces propelled her. She needed to be strong. She needed to be smart. Carefully, Ilara tied the steel cable to the handle of the metal box, using the carabiner to secure the attachment. She tested the knot several times, pulling with all her strength. It seemed secure. Then she began to unroll the cable, slowly lowering the box towards the silo floor. The metal scraped against the wall, producing a shrill, echoing sound in the void. Below, the babies stopped crying for an instant, watching the box descend. Ilara felt a pang of hope. They were curious, perhaps even a little less frightened. The box finally reached the floor. Ilara moved it with the cable until it was close enough to the babies. She needed to descend again to place them inside. The idea of climbing the rope once more, with her already aching muscles, was almost unbearable, but there was no other option. With a deep breath, Ilara began to descend, her heart pounding in her chest. Each descent was a risk, but she would not hesitate. Her children awaited her, and with each step, each effort, the promise of finding the true treasure, pure water, life, seemed a little closer, hidden in the depths of that metal monster. She would find it. She had to find it. Her children awaited her. The rope, already rough in her hands, felt even thinner and more precarious this time. Her muscles, already exhausted, protested with every movement, burning with a searing pain. The dust and the smell of rusty metal seemed more intense, suffocating. She forced herself to ignore the pain, focusing only on the approaching floor where her little points of light awaited. Finally, her feet touched the cold, uneven floor. She knelt, gasping, and crawled to the babies. They were huddled together, one whimpering softly, the other with wide eyes watching her. Ilara hugged them tightly, feeling the warmth of their small bodies against hers, a balm for her tormented soul. "Mama's here, my loves," she whispered, kissing their sweaty foreheads. "Let's go up. Let's go to a safe place." Carefully, she picked up the crying baby, the smallest one, and nestled him in her arms. He stopped crying, looking at her with an expression of trust that broke her heart. Ilara approached the metal box, which lay open on the floor. It was a cold, hard container, but it was their only chance. She lined the bottom with a piece of fabric she managed to tear from nearby debris, a piece of old, dusty tarp, but one that would offer a minimum of comfort. With trembling hands, she carefully placed the baby inside the box. He stirred, letting out a small sound of surprise, but didn't cry. Ilara knelt beside the box, speaking softly, trying to calm him, promising that everything would be all right. She checked the carabiner and the steel cable, ensuring they were firmly attached. Now, the hardest part. She needed to climb back to the platform while pulling the box, which was heavy even with just one baby. Ilara positioned herself, holding the rope with one hand and the steel cable with the other. "You'll be all right, my love," she said to the baby in the box, her voice choked. The process was excruciating. Each pull on the steel cable was a monumental effort, her muscles screaming in protest. The metal of the box scraped against the silo wall, producing a sharp, dragging sound that echoed in the void. Ilara climbed centimeter by centimeter, her teeth clenched, sweat trickling down her face. She looked up at the dark platform and down at the baby in the box, who watched her with wide eyes. The fear that the cable would snap, that the box would fall, was a sharp knife in her chest. When she finally managed to hoist the box to the edge of the platform, her arms trembled uncontrollably. With a final effort, she pulled it up to the safety of the solid metal. Ilara knelt beside the box, opening it and taking the baby into her arms. He was frightened, but unharmed. She kissed him repeatedly, feeling a wave of relief so intense it almost brought her to her knees. She carried the baby to the niche she had found. It was small and dark, but it offered refuge from the drafts and debris. She nestled him there, covering him with the tarp, and he soon fell asleep, exhausted. But there was still the other. Ilara looked down at the second baby, who was now crying louder, feeling the absence of his brother and mother. Guilt and urgency propelled her. Her muscles screamed, but she couldn't stop. With the same determination, she descended again. The second descent was even more painful, but the image of her child's frightened little face kept her from giving up. She picked him up, calmed him, and placed him in the box, repeating the ritual of safety and promises. The second hoisting was an even greater torture. Every fiber of her body seemed to be at its limit. She felt her heart pound in her chest, the air burning in her lungs, but she refused to break. She was their only hope. Finally, the second box was on the platform. Ilara took the second baby, hugging him with the same intensity, feeling the same overwhelming relief. She carried him to the niche, placing him beside his sleeping brother. The two were together, safe, at least for now. Ilara sat on the cold floor of the platform, leaning against the wall, exhausted. Her arms and legs trembled, and a deep ache spread throughout her body. But when she looked at the two babies nestled in the small niche, sleeping peacefully, a rare and precious sense of peace washed over her. She had succeeded. They were on the first level, together. There was still much to do. Hunger and thirst were constant threats, and the air remained cold and dense. But now they had shelter, a starting point. The silo was still a metal monster, but she had conquered a small piece of it. The true treasure, pure water, the promise of life, was still hidden in the depths. But Ilara knew she was one step closer. She would find it. For her children, she would find it. Exhaustion was a heavy cloak that draped over Ilara, pulling her to the cold, metallic floor. Her muscles screamed in a symphony of pain, every fiber seemingly stretched to its limit. But nestled in the small niche, her children slept. The soft sound of their breaths was the only melody that mattered, muffling the echo of pain in her body. She watched them, their angelic faces illuminated by the faint light filtering from some distant crevice, and a tenuous, almost fragile peace settled in her chest. They were safe. Together. At least for now. The silo, once an abyss of terror, now seemed like a sleeping monster, its metallic entrails silent. But the stillness was deceptive. The cold, dense air still carried the smell of metal and dust, and the threat of hunger and thirst loomed over them like a relentless shadow. Ilara knew the relief was temporary. Her children would soon wake, and the reality of their basic needs would return with full force. With a groan of effort, she crawled closer to the niche, feeling the faint warmth emanating from the small bodies. The piece of old tarp she had used as lining was minimal comfort, but it was all they had. She needed more warmth, more security, and above all, water and food. She scanned the platform again, now with a renewed purpose. She needed to transform that piece of hell into a home, however rudimentary. There was more debris, more empty boxes, more twisted metal sheets. She began to search, moving with the slowness of a body pushed to its limit. She found another piece of fabric, a thick, dirty rag that, with a little sacrifice, could be used to cover the niche entrance, blocking the drafts. She tied it with loose wires she found, creating a kind of makeshift curtain. It was little, but it was a start. The search for water was the most urgent. The premise that the outside air was poisonous meant that any water source would have to be inside the silo, protected from contamination. Ilara crawled across the platform, examining every crack, every seam in the metal, every dark corner. She hoped to find a broken pipe, a puddle of condensation, any sign of moisture. But there was nothing, just dry metal and dust. Frustration began to gnaw at her determination. Where could there be water in such a sterile place? The silo was a man-made structure designed to contain missiles, not to sustain life. But the story's premise spoke of a treasure, of pure water in the depths. The depths. That meant she would have to go even deeper. She approached the edge of the platform, looking into the dark abyss below. The rope was still there, hanging, an invitation to the unknown. Fear was a knot in her stomach, but the image of her thirsty children was a more powerful engine. She couldn't take them down yet, not without knowing what she would find. But she could descend alone, explore, seek the promised treasure. "I will find it," she whispered into the void, her voice hoarse but laden with a fierce promise. "I will find the water." She needed a plan. The rope and steel cable would be her allies, but she needed something to collect the water, if she found it. Her eyes fell upon the metal box she had used to hoist the babies. It was a container, rustic but functional. It could serve. Ilara sat down again, leaning against the cold wall, her gaze fixed on the niche where her children slept. She had taken them from the silo floor, placed them in a safe spot. Now the next step was to ensure they had the essentials to survive. The journey into the depths would be the most dangerous of all, but she would not hesitate. Pure water, life, awaited them below. And Ilara, the widow, the mother, was ready to go fetch it. With every breath, every heartbeat, the promise of life pulsed, a beacon in the metallic darkness of the silo. She would descend. She would find it. For her children, she would find it. With a heavy sigh, Ilara stood up, her muscles protesting with every movement. She approached the niche, kneeling to kiss the forehead of each of her children. "Mama will be back soon, my loves," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Stay safe here." The guilt of leaving them, even for a short while, was an almost unbearable burden, but the need was greater than the fear. She picked up the metal box, checking its handles and integrity. It was sturdy enough. Then, she examined the carabiner and the steel cable, testing the firmness of their connections. She needed something to light the way. Her eyes fell upon a twisted piece of metal with a sharp point that she had used to scrape debris. It wasn't a torch, but it could be a foothold or an improvised tool. She attached it to her belt, along with the extra piece of tarp she had found, in case she needed more insulation or to filter something. The darkness below seemed denser now, a void that swallowed the little light coming from above. The air, already cold, seemed to grow even colder as she approached the edge. Ilara took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She clung to the rope, feeling its rough, cold texture in her hands. The steel cable, thinner and smoother, would be her guide. With one last look at the niche where her children slept, Ilara pushed herself off the platform. The descent began. Slowly she let herself slide, the metal of the wall scraping against her clothes, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence of the silo. The light from the platform diminished rapidly, and darkness swallowed her, transforming the world into a canvas of shadows and echoes. She was descending into the unknown, into the entrails of the metal monster, in search of the promise of life. Every meter was an act of faith, every pull on the rope a silent prayer. The treasure awaited, and Ilara was determined to find it. The descent was a torment. Ilara's hands burned, the rope cutting her skin even through the makeshift gloves she had fashioned from scraps of cloth. The steel cable guided her, but the darkness was almost absolute, interrupted only by occasional flashes of light that seemed to come from tiny crevices far above. She used the sharp piece of metal to scrape the wall, trying to feel for any change in texture, any protrusion that might indicate a new level or a fissure. The sound of metal scraping against metal was her only companion, a monotonous lament in the void. She descended for what felt like an eternity, her arms and legs trembling with exhaustion. The air grew heavier, more humid, and a different smell began to mix with the odor of metal and dust, an earthy, almost mineral scent. A faint hope ignited in her chest. Could this be it? Could it be a sign? Suddenly, her feet touched something more solid than the silo wall, a ledge, a natural platform, or a forgotten maintenance structure. She fumbled in the dark, finding an uneven, rocky surface that contrasted with the smooth metal. With a monumental effort, Ilara pulled herself up, falling to her knees, gasping. The darkness was so dense she couldn't see her own hand. "Water," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I need water." She crawled across the uneven surface, using the sharp piece of metal to feel her way. The earthy smell intensified, and now a faint, almost imperceptible sound reached her ears. A drip. A soft, constant drip that seemed to come from somewhere ahead of her. She crawled faster, the pain in her muscles forgotten, hope propelling her. The dripping grew louder, transforming into a soft murmur. She reached out in the dark, and her fingers touched something cold and wet. It wasn't metal, it was rock, and the rock was damp. She fumbled further, following the sound, until her fingers found a fissure in the rock, and from within the fissure, a trickle of liquid flowed, gleaming faintly in the darkness, reflecting the little light her now adapted eyes could perceive. It was water, pure, crystal clear, flowing from a vein in the rock. Ilara couldn't hold back a sob. Hot tears streamed down her face, mixing with the dirt and sweat. She had found it, the treasure, the antithesis of the toxicity surrounding them. She took the metal box from her belt, carefully positioning it under the drip. The sound of water falling into the empty container was the sweetest melody she had ever heard. She waited, watching the water levels slowly rise in the box. With each drop, life pulsed, a renewed promise. When the box was half full, Ilara couldn't bear it any longer. She dipped her hand into the water, feeling its pure coolness, and brought it to her lips. The taste was indescribable, the essence of life, washing away the dryness from her throat and the exhaustion from her soul. "I found it," she whispered into the void, her voice choked with emotion and gratitude. "I found the water." The task of climbing back up would be as arduous as the descent, but now she had something to take back, something that meant life, her children. She needed to return to them. With the box of precious water in one hand and the rope in the other, Ilara looked up into the darkness that separated her from her babies. The journey back would be a test of her strength, but she was ready. She had the water. She had hope. The ascent was a different kind of nightmare than the descent. Every muscle in Ilara's body screamed in protest, and the weight of the metal box, now full of precious water, seemed to double with every meter. She had secured it to her belt with the extra tarp, but the constant swinging and the effort to maintain balance while clinging to the rope were excruciating. The steel cable, once a guide, now felt like a cold blade against her skin, and the darkness persisted, only slightly less dense, as she approached the point where the light from the upper platform should begin to appear. "My children," she murmured, with every pull, every push, "for you." The image of their sleeping faces was the only beacon in her mind, the only thing that kept her from giving up and letting herself fall into the abyss. The water in the box was more than a liquid. It was the promise, the reward, life itself. She could not fail. Her fingers were raw, despite the makeshift gloves, and sweat streamed down her face, mixing with dirt and dried tears. The air, which had become more humid and earthy below, now reverted to the cold metallic air of the silo, a constant reminder of the prison that surrounded them. She felt exhaustion seep into her bones, but adrenaline and urgency kept her moving. After what felt like an eternity, a pale, distant glow appeared above. It wasn't a strong light, but enough for her to know she was getting close. A wave of relief, as intense as the pain in her body, swept over her. She was almost there. With renewed breath, Ilara redoubled her efforts, pulling herself up with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Finally, her hands fumbled for the edge of the platform. With a groan of effort, she pushed herself up, rolling onto the metal floor, gasping and exhausted. The water box gently clattered beside her. She lay there for a moment, her body trembling uncontrollably, her heart pounding like a discordant drum. The faint light coming from the top of the silo seemed like a miracle, illuminating the dust dancing in the air. "I made it," she whispered, her voice hoarse and almost inaudible. With immense effort, Ilara crawled to the niche where her children slept. They were quiet, small and vulnerable, their chests rising and falling in a gentle rhythm. The sight of them renewed her strength, and she sat down, pulling the metal box close. With trembling hands, she took a piece of clean cloth she had saved and wet it in the water. Carefully, she brought it to the lips of each baby, letting the pure moisture touch their small mouths. The older baby, with a sigh, opened his eyes for an instant, his lips instinctively moving to suck the cloth. A tear rolled down Ilara's face. She repeated the process with the other, and then, with the wet cloth, gently wiped their faces, removing the dirt and sweat. It was a simple gesture, but laden with deep love and a promise of care. "Mama brought water, my loves," she whispered, kissing each of their foreheads. "Pure water. We're going to be all right." The water in the box was an invaluable treasure. It wasn't just for drinking, it was for hygiene, for hope. She looked at the box, then at the surroundings. The silo was still a metal monster, but now, with the source of life discovered, the perspective changed. She had found the pulsating heart of that place, the antithesis of the toxicity that surrounded them. Exhaustion overwhelmed her, but the peace she felt was overwhelming. She leaned against the cold wall, pulling the babies closer, nestling them in her arms. The water was there, a tangible reminder of her victory. The journey was still long, but the first and most crucial step had been taken. They had water, they had hope. And Ilara, the widow, the mother, knew that as long as she had that, she would find a way to transform that metallic hell into a home. Exhaustion was a dense fog that threatened to swallow Ilara, but the warmth of her children's bodies and the presence of the metal box, now a sanctuary of life, anchored her. She allowed herself to close her eyes for an instant, feeling the tremor in her muscles slowly subside. The smell of metal and dust still hung in the air, but now, in her mind, it mingled with the subtle fragrance of pure water, a promise of cleanliness and renewal. "We made it. My loves," she whispered again, her voice almost a breath. The older baby stirred in her arms, a small sigh escaping his lips. Ilara kissed his forehead, feeling the soft warmth of his skin. The water wasn't just to quench thirst, it was to wash away dirt, to soothe fever, for life in all its forms. It was the first brick in building a home in that abyss. She opened her eyes, the faint light from the top of the silo seeming more welcoming now. The platform, once a temporary refuge, began to transform in her mind. It was no longer just a place to survive, but a starting point. The water box, though precious, was small. She would need more, much more. Her gaze swept the surroundings. The extra piece of tarp, which she had taken down and brought back, lay rolled beside her. Could it be used to collect more water? Perhaps, if she could create a more efficient dripping system, or if there were more fissures in the rock. The sharp piece of metal, her exploration tool, now seemed like a construction instrument. The task of descending and ascending again with more containers would be monumental. But physical pain was a small price to pay for her children's lives. She needed to find more boxes, more containers. The silo, in its vastness, surely held more secrets, more remnants of the civilization that had built and abandoned it. "Tomorrow," she thought, the voice in her mind sounding stronger, more determined. "Tomorrow, I will descend again." But with a plan. She needed a system to descend and ascend safely, perhaps using the rope and steel cable to create a kind of improvised pulley, if she found the right materials. And she needed containers. She remembered the loose metal panels she had seen on upper levels, or perhaps even in the depths near the source. Could she mold them? It would be a challenge, but not impossible. The air in the silo, though cold and metallic, didn't seem so oppressive now. The discovery of water had infused new hope, a sense of control over the hostile environment. If there was pure water, perhaps there were other things. Perhaps the volcanic crater, in its apparent toxicity, hid more secrets, more resources. Ilara pulled the babies closer, feeling the warmth of their small bodies against hers. The journey to transform that metallic hell into a home was just beginning, but the hardest step had been taken. They had water, and with water came the possibility of hygiene, of preparing food, if she found any, of sustaining life. She looked at the metal box where the water rested, reflecting the distant light like a small lake of stars. It was the antithesis of the toxicity that surrounded them, an oasis in the metal desert. That precious liquid was proof that life always finds a way, even in the most inhospitable places. Ilara's mind began to work, no longer in a panic, but with a calculating calm. She needed a place to store the water safely, protected from dust and any contamination. She needed a system to purify the air, even if rudimentary. She needed warmth and food, but for now she had water, and that was everything. It was enough to take the next step. With a deep sigh, Ilara allowed herself to rest, her body exhausted, but her soul filled with a new and fierce determination. The silo was still a monster, but she had found its weak point, its pulsating heart, and she would use that to build a future for her children. Night fell upon them, but for the first time in a long time, the darkness didn't seem so frightening. It brought the promise of a new day, and with it, the hope of a home.